had never intended to end up in that cabin. It was supposed to be a weekend retreat, a quiet getaway in the French countryside where I could clear my head, a break from the noise, the clutter of city life. But something about the place felt off. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun already beginning to dip behind the distant hills, casting long shadows across the fields. The cabin sat alone at the edge of a thick forest, surrounded by tall, dense trees that seemed to loom, pressing in on the small, weathered structure. It wasn't much, a simple one-story building with a sloping roof and stone walls. No neighbors for miles, just an old dirt road that wound its way through the trees. I'd rented the place from a local who told me the cabin had been in his family for generations. He had been friendly, but there was something odd about his manner. The way he spoke, like he was trying to convince me to be cautious without outright saying it. "It's peaceful though," he'd said a little too quickly. "If you're okay with being alone." I'd laughed it off at the time. I liked solitude after all. Inside, the cabin was simple with just the basics: a bed, a small kitchen, and a fireplace. The air smelled of old wood and earth. It felt like stepping back in time, like I was in some forgotten corner of the world. First, I thought I would enjoy it. The quiet was refreshing. The isolation, though a bit unnerving, was also kind of nice. I made myself a meal, sat by the fire, and read a book. But the peace didn't last long. As the night wore on, I began to notice things. Little things that didn't make sense. The floorboards creaked in ways they shouldn't have, as though someone else was walking around in the house. When I looked up from my book, I thought I saw shadows moving past the windows, though no one was there. I told myself it was just my imagination. I had been cooped up in the city for too long, used to the hum of traffic and the buzz of people. It was natural to be a little jumpy in a place this isolated. I went to bed early, hoping that a good night's sleep would clear my head. That night, I woke to the sound of scratching. It was faint at first, almost like a mouse scurrying across the floor, but it grew louder, more deliberate. My heart started pounding in my chest. I held my breath, straining to hear. There it was again, scratching, followed by a soft thud. I was paralyzed, my body stiff with fear. It wasn't an animal. It was too slow, too purposeful. Came from the attic. I didn't move. I kept my eyes fixed on the ceiling, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. A tree branch brushing against the roof, maybe. The wind shifting. But the scratching continued. And then I heard a different sound. A low, muffled thud, like something heavy being dragged across the floor above me. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and crept to the attic ladder. My mind raced. There was no reason for anyone to be up there. The cabin was isolated. No one knew I was here except for the local who had rented it to me, and he had seemed perfectly normal. With a deep breath, I pulled open the attic door. The flashlight beam flickered, cutting through the darkness. The attic was small, filled with old wooden beams and boxes covered in dust. I moved through the narrow space, shining the light over the piles of forgotten belongings. But there was nothing there, nothing except the strange feeling of being watched. I stepped back, and that's when I noticed the door. At the far end of the attic, a door I had missed earlier. It was slightly ajar, and there was something odd about it, like it had been opened recently. The door led to a small room, barely large enough for a bed. The air inside was stale, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust. But it wasn't the dust that caught my attention. It was the smell. A sharp, acrid scent, like rotting wood or something worse. The room felt wrong, as though it had been sealed off for a reason. I walked in, drawn by some unseen force, and that's when I saw it. On the far wall, scrawled in what looked like dried mud, was a symbol. It was crude, twisted, and looked almost like something from an old ritual. My blood ran cold. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it didn't belong here. I turned to leave, but as I did, something caught my eye, a faint outline in the corner of the room, a shape that didn't quite fit with the shadows. It was a door, or at least it had once been a door. There was no handle, no frame, just a gap in the wall that looked like it had been hastily sealed shut. I pushed against it, and to my surprise, it gave way, revealing a narrow passage. It led down into the earth. My heart thudded in my chest. What was this? Why hadn't the local mentioned this hidden passage? Why had he seemed so uneasy when I asked about the cabin? I hesitated. Part of me wanted to run, to bolt out of that cabin and never look back. But something else, something darker, urged me forward. I had to know what was down there. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped into the passage. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, and the walls were rough, almost carved out by hand. The passage was narrow, the stone walls cold and wet. It twisted and turned, descending further underground. My flashlight flickered again, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. I could hear the sound of dripping water in the distance, echoing through the tunnels. After what felt like hours, I reached the end of the passage. It opened up into a small chamber, lit only by the dim beam of my flashlight. The walls of the chamber were covered in more strange symbols, painted in red and brown. At the center of the room, there was a large stone altar, covered in dust but otherwise undisturbed. I took a step forward, and that's when I heard it. A low, guttural sound, like something was breathing just behind me. I spun around, my flashlight trembling in my hand, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the silence. The heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to hang in the air, thick with dread. My mind raced. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something was wrong. Someone or something had been down here recently. I turned to leave, but as I did, I saw movement in the shadows. A figure, tall and thin, standing just at the edge of the light. I didn't wait to find out who it was. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in the cabin, heart hammering in my chest, sweat pouring down my face. I slammed the door behind me and locked it. I didn't care if I was being irrational. I didn't care about the cabin anymore. I just needed to leave. The next morning, I packed up quickly, barely bothering to collect my things. I didn't even finish my coffee. I didn't look back. As I drove away, the cabin grew smaller in my rearview mirror, swallowed by the thick trees that surrounded it. I didn't know what I had discovered down there, but I knew I wasn't going back. Whatever secret that cabin held, it was better left untouched. Years later, I still wonder about the passage beneath that cabin, the altar, the symbols. I've never been back to that part of France, and I doubt I ever will. But the memories linger, and sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the scratching from the attic. And every now and then, I wonder if anyone else will ever find that hidden door. I took the job because I needed the money. That's how these things usually start. It wasn't about the experience, the solitude, or any of the things that make people romanticize the idea of being alone in the woods. I just needed a paycheck. It was supposed to be a simple job. Maintain a small logging outpost deep in the mountains of Oregon for the winter. A skeleton crew ran the place in the summer, but come late October, most of the operation shut down. My job was to keep an eye on the equipment, make sure the generator stayed running, and keep the cabin in decent shape until the crew came back in April. They called it a cabin, but it was really more of a large shack. One main room with a cot in the corner, a wood-burning stove, a table, and a few chairs. The bathroom was a pit toilet outside. There was a small shed where they stored tools, and about a quarter-mile away, an old trailer that had been used for additional sleeping quarters back when the operation was bigger. The guy who had done the job before me had left in a hurry. He was supposed to stay until mid-November, but the company got a call in early October saying he was done, and they needed someone to replace him immediately. They never told me why. I never asked. I should have. The first few weeks were fine. Cold, boring, but fine. The wind howled at night, and I could hear animals moving around in the dark, but I'd grown up in rural Montana. I knew the sounds of the woods. It wasn't until late November that I started noticing things. One morning, I found footprints near the shed. Not boot prints, not anything that looked like an animal.
Bare footprints.
Human. The snow around them was fresh, which meant they had been made during the night. They led from the tree line to the shed door, then back again. Nothing was missing from the shed, as far as I could tell. Nothing had been disturbed. I told myself it was my own footprint, maybe distorted by the way the snow had settled. I knew that wasn't true, but it kept me from losing my mind for a while. A few nights later, I woke up to a sound outside. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. It was steady, rhythmic, something tapping against the side of the cabin. I stayed in bed, listening. It went on for at least 10 minutes before stopping. In the morning, I went outside to check. I expected to see a branch swinging in the wind, maybe knocking against the wall. There was nothing, but I did see something else. Another set of bare footprints, starting at the tree line and stopping right at the wall of the cabin, right where I had heard the tapping. I didn't go back inside right away. I stood there staring at them. They were deep. Whoever had made them had stood there for a long time, watching. December came. The generator had issues, but I managed to fix it. The days were getting shorter, the nights darker. One evening, I took the snowmobile out to check the trailer. It was just for peace of mind. I wanted to make sure everything was still locked up. It wasn't. The door was open, swinging in the wind. I killed the engine and sat there for a long time, just listening. There were no tracks in the snow leading up to the trailer. Nothing to suggest anyone had been there recently. I got off the snowmobile and stepped toward the door. Inside, it was just as I remembered, dusty, cold, abandoned. I checked the corners under the cots. Nothing. But when I turned to leave, I saw it. Near the door, scratched into the wood, were 3 words. "Who are you?" I ran back to the snowmobile and didn't look back. I told myself it had been there before, that I just hadn't noticed. That was a lie. I didn't go back to the trailer after that. I started locking the cabin door at night. I kept the axe inside right next to the cot. The tapping came back a few nights later. Louder this time. I didn't move, didn't breathe, stopped after a while, but I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning, I went outside. The footprints were back. They led from the trees to the cabin wall, but this time they didn't go back. They just stopped, like whoever made them had vanished into thin air. By January, I wasn't eating much. I wasn't sleeping. I kept the stove burning day and night, more for the light than the warmth. That's when I heard it. Not tapping this time. Knocking. Slow. Deliberate. On the door. I sat on the cot, gripping the axe. My breath felt frozen in my lungs. The knocking stopped. A long silence followed. Then I heard it. The door handle. Turning. It was locked. A minute passed. Then 2. Then 3. Then, finally, the footsteps. Slow, crunching footsteps moving away from the cabin. I didn't check until morning. The prints led back to the trees. They were fresh. They weren't alone. There were more this time. 2 sets. I was done. I packed what I could, loaded up the snowmobile, and left that same morning. I rode down the mountain without stopping. I didn't tell the company the full truth. I just told them the weather was getting worse and I didn't feel safe up there anymore. They didn't argue. Maybe they already knew. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't want to know. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, I still hear it. The tapping. It was a cold evening in late October when I was called in for a night shift at the remote cop station. I've been a deputy for 6 years, and though this station was small and isolated, I'd worked here enough to know it well. The station was in a cabin, situated on the edge of a dense forest in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, far from any major town. It was the kind of place where you only go if you're either looking for something or running away from something. The kind of place you'd find yourself alone in for hours, the only sound being the howling wind outside or the occasional crack of a branch. The weather had been off all day, with a storm rolling in from the west. By the time I pulled into the gravel lot of the cabin station, the clouds had darkened and the wind was picking up. The old wooden structure creaked in the breeze, its front porch lit dimly by a single flickering bulb. I took a deep breath, already feeling the weight of the night. It was just going to be a regular shift, or so I thought. A few calls from locals, maybe a couple of patrols. But something about the atmosphere tonight felt different, heavier. I parked my truck next to the station and grabbed my gear. Inside, the cabin smelled like stale coffee and the wood burning in the stove. The heat from the fire a welcome contrast to the biting cold outside. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly as I hung my jacket by the door. The walls lined with faded maps and old crime reports from years gone by. It was a place that felt stuck in time. Nothing particularly new or exciting happening here. Just a small town station with a handful of officers trying to keep the peace. As I settled in behind the desk, the radio crackled to life. The voice of a fellow officer on the other end. "Deputy Langston, you there?" I sighed, rubbing my temples. I was getting too old for this late-night routine. "Yeah, I'm here. What's up?" "There's a report coming in about strange noises out by the old Miller cabin, just outside your jurisdiction, but we figured you might want to check it out. Call if you need backup." The Miller cabin. I'd heard about it. It was an abandoned place, empty for years, a spot the locals liked to whisper about. They said strange things happened there, but most of those rumors were born from boredom and a wild imagination. Still, something about the way the officer said it made me pause. Maybe it was the tension in his voice or the fact that I knew that area was isolated. "Got it?" I replied, grabbing my flashlight and my sidearm. "I'll head over." The drive took me down winding dirt roads, the headlights of my truck cutting through the dark, damp forest. I could hear the wind picking up, the trees creaking as if they were alive, groaning under the pressure of the storm. The rain began to fall, first lightly, then in heavy sheets, hitting the windshield with a sharp hiss. The road was narrow, and the dense trees crowded in on either side. It felt like the forest was swallowing the truck whole. The Miller cabin sat at the end of the road, tucked deep in the woods. As I approached, the place looked even more eerie than I remembered. The cabin itself was in bad shape, its windows boarded up, its front door hanging loosely on its hinges, almost as if the building were holding its breath, waiting for something. The darkness seemed to deepen around it, a void that swallowed any light. I parked a good distance away, not wanting to risk getting too close just yet. The air felt different here, colder, as though the place itself exhaled something unnatural. I stepped out of the truck, the rain soaking my jacket instantly. My boots sank into the muddy ground as I made my way toward the cabin. The only sound the squelch of my steps and the distant rumble of thunder. The flashlight beam barely reached the edges of the forest, and I felt an unsettling prickle at the back of my neck. It was like being watched, though I couldn't see a single soul. I approached the cabin carefully, trying to take in any sound or movement around me. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees. My flashlight scanned the area, landing on the cabin's rotting exterior.
No lights.
No signs of life. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. The front door was ajar, something that hadn't been the case when I drove by. The wind might have blown it open, but it seemed odd that it was just wide enough to allow a person to slip through. My instincts kicked in. Something wasn't right here. I pulled my flashlight out of its holder, its beam sharp against the wet, dark wood. I stepped closer, pushing the door open slightly with my shoulder. It creaked loudly, echoing into the quiet of the night. Inside was pitch black, but I could make out the faint outline of furniture and debris scattered across the floor. It was just as abandoned as I remembered. No movement, no signs of life, just silence. I took a cautious step inside, my boots crunching against broken glass and rotting wood. The air inside smelled stale, damp, with a faint odor of decay. It wasn't just the cabin that had been left to rot. Something about this place felt like it had been forgotten by time itself. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up again. It was that feeling, the one you get when something is terribly out of place. I'd been on many calls before. People scared of noises, animals, the occasional drunk trying to get a rise out of the town. But this was different. This wasn't a typical call. I moved further in, trying to make sense of the scene. It was odd that anyone would be here, let alone make their way into this decrepit structure. As I shone my flashlight across the room, I noticed a door leading into the back of the house. It was closed, but a faint light leaked from beneath it. My hand tightened on my gun. Whoever was here wasn't just passing through. I approached slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The closer I got, the more the air seemed to thicken, like it was pressing against me. I reached for the door handle, hesitating just for a moment. It was now or never. My instincts screamed that I needed to be prepared for whatever waited behind it. I twisted the knob and pushed the door open, my flashlight darting inside. The room was small, and the walls were lined with old newspapers, faded photographs, and strange markings that looked like they had been scratched into the wood. But it wasn't what was on the walls that caught my attention. It was the body. The body of a man lay sprawled across the floor, his eyes wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. He had been dead for some time, his skin pale and cold, his body stiff in the way only the deceased can be. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no wounds that would explain his death. But the way he lay there, so unnatural, made me uneasy. I stepped back, taking in the full picture of the room. The body wasn't the only unsettling thing. There were bags of something in the corners, piles of old clothes, and strange markings on the floor that I couldn't immediately make sense of. Everything about this room screamed wrong. It was like a shrine to something dark. I pulled my radio out, trying to stay calm. I needed backup, but I didn't want to take my eyes off the room long enough to make a call. Just as I was about to lift the radio to my mouth, I heard something, scraping noises coming from behind me. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the storm. It was something moving. My flashlight flicked wildly across the room as I turned, my gun raised. But there was nothing there, just the empty space of the cabin, the silence pressing in. And yet, something still felt terribly off. The night stretched on, a long, tense blur of waiting. I secured the scene the best I could, but the feeling that I wasn't alone in the cabin never left. I waited for backup, but the storm had made the roads impassable for anyone but the most determined. The minutes turned into hours, and still, I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. By the time my partner, Deputy Harper, finally arrived, after what seemed like an eternity, the storm had died down, but the atmosphere remained thick with something unspoken. We processed the scene together, though neither of us mentioned how the place seemed to weigh heavier with every step we took. Harper pulled me aside later, his voice low. "You feel it, don't you? There's something wrong with this place." I nodded, my eyes scanning the dark edges of the cabin. The unease hadn't gone away. We left together, but as we walked back to the truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been in that cabin, whatever had claimed it, was still out there, waiting. I don't know what happened in that cabin, but I don't need to. All I know is that the peace I once took for granted in the woods was gone. replaced by something darker, something that I couldn't fully understand. And when I left the cabin that night, I couldn't help but feel as if it had let me go, alive, but only just. I never expected to find myself in a situation like this, but that's how things go, isn't it? Life's unpredictable. One moment you're planning a quiet weekend getaway to clear your head, and the next you're facing something that'll haunt you for years. It was late September when I decided to get away. I was 34 at the time, living in a small town in Oregon, struggling with the kind of stress that comes from working too many hours at a job that demanded more than I was willing to give. I needed to disconnect, so when I found a small cabin available for rent up in the mountains, it seemed like the perfect solution. I packed my bags, threw in a few books, some snacks, and my camping gear just in case. The drive there was peaceful, the kind of quiet you only find in places where the trees are thick and the roads are barely wide enough for a car to fit through. The GPS didn't even work for the last part of the drive, which only made it feel more secluded. But it didn't bother me. In fact, it made the place feel more special. The cabin was nestled deep in a forest, a small, rustic structure made of weathered wood and stone, with a stone chimney curling smoke into the cold autumn air. It wasn't fancy by any means, but that was part of the charm. It had a warmth to it, the kind you only get from something that's been around for a while. There was a small porch with an old rocking chair and a hammock stretched between two trees nearby. I arrived around noon and unpacked my things quickly. The owner, an older man named Jack, had left me the key in a small tin box hidden under the porch. He was a bit odd in his manner, but he seemed harmless enough. He mentioned something about how the weather could turn fast this time of year, but I didn't think much of it at the time. The first day passed quietly. I spent the afternoon hiking around the area, taking in the fall colors of the trees, the crunch of leaves beneath my boots, and the crisp mountain air that felt like a refreshing slap to the face after weeks of being cooped up in a stuffy office. I didn't see anyone else, which was perfect.
No distractions.
As nightfall approached, I settled in by the cabin's wood stove, the fire crackling as I made a simple meal. The windows were thick with condensation, and I could barely make out the dark shapes of trees beyond the glass. The quietness of the place was almost unsettling, but in a way, I welcomed it. For once, I didn't have to deal with the noise of traffic, the hum of electronics, or the constant buzz of work emails. Around 10 p.m., I decided to head to bed. I wasn't tired, but I figured I should get some rest before the hike the next day. The bed in the cabin was small but comfortable, and the quilt on top smelled faintly of pine, adding to the rustic charm of the place. I lay there, watching the flickering light of the fire through the small gap in the door. I don't know when I first heard it, but there was a sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind or the crackling of the fire. But then, I heard it again, a soft thudding, like footsteps on the porch. My heart skipped a beat. I lay still, listening. The footsteps weren't heavy, but they were deliberate, slow, as if someone was walking carefully, making sure not to make a sound. I was alone, or so I thought. Jack had mentioned that the cabin was in a very remote area, so the chances of someone else being out here were slim. I hesitated for a moment, debating whether I should check it out or ignore it, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight from the side table and quietly slid out of bed. The moment I stepped onto the wooden floor, the footsteps stopped. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. There was a tense silence that seemed to stretch on forever. My hand tightened around the flashlight, but I didn't move. Not yet. Minutes passed before I finally convinced myself to approach the door. I slowly turned the handle, holding my breath as I stepped out onto the porch. The light from the cabin illuminated the space in front of me, but nothing was there. just the darkness of the forest and the gentle rustling of leaves in the wind. Relieved but still on edge, I checked around the side of the cabin and along the trees, but there was no sign of anyone. The air was cold, and my breath came out in white clouds. I stood there for a few more moments, staring into the dark, before I decided to go back inside. The next morning, I convinced myself that it was nothing. Maybe it had been an animal, or maybe I had imagined it. The cabin was old, after all. It creaked and groaned with every shift in temperature, and the wind could make odd noises when it got caught in the trees. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I spent most of the day hiking deeper into the forest, following a narrow trail that Jack had pointed out to me. The sun was high in the sky, and the forest was quiet, save for the occasional bird call. I hadn't seen anyone else during my hike, but there was a lingering sense of being watched. I couldn't explain it. It was just a feeling that crept up on me when I stopped to rest or looked over my shoulder. That evening, after another solitary dinner by the fire, I decided to go to bed early. I was tired from the hike, and I figured a good night's rest would help me shake off the uneasy feeling from the previous night. But just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard it again. The footsteps. This time they were louder, more distinct. There was no mistaking it. Someone was on the porch, walking back and forth, pacing. I held my breath, listening for any other sounds, but there was nothing. No car engine, no voice, just the steady rhythm of footsteps. My heart began to race, and I fought the urge to panic. I knew that I had to stay calm, to figure out what was going on. The last thing I wanted was to let fear get the best of me. But fear was there, clawing at the edges of my mind. I waited and waited. The pacing continued for what felt like an eternity. It was as if whoever it was had all the time in the world. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the sound stopped. I didn't know what to do. I was terrified, but I couldn't just sit there. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. Of course, I knew that would be the case. I had left my car keys on the counter in the cabin. If I wanted to leave, I'd have to go outside and get them. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it someone trying to rob me? Someone who had been following me? Or worse, someone who lived out in the woods, watching me? The night dragged on in silence, and I lay there paralyzed by fear. Couldn't sleep, not a single moment. Eventually, I decided to leave. I made my way to the door, slowly, carefully, as if I were sneaking out. My flashlight illuminated the porch, the trees beyond. It was still dark, too dark. There was no sign of anyone, but the feeling of being watched lingered in the back of my mind. I stepped outside, my heart pounding in my chest. My eyes scanned the surrounding area. Nothing, no one, just the dark, empty forest. I moved quickly to the cabin side, where I'd left my keys on the counter earlier. I grabbed them, but just as I turned back toward the door, I saw something, a figure, a shadow in the trees, moving just beyond the reach of the flashlight's beam. I froze. My pulse thudded in my ears. The shadow was too far to make out any details, but I could feel it. Someone was out there, watching. With my keys in hand, I ran back into the cabin and locked the door behind me. I stayed inside the rest of the night, not daring to step out again. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, but I wasn't sure if it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The next morning, I packed up my things quickly. I didn't care about the hike I had planned or the fact that I'd paid for the cabin. I just needed to leave. Something told me that the woods weren't safe, that there was someone or something out there watching, waiting. As I drove down the narrow road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But there was nothing, just the long stretch of road winding through the trees, disappearing behind me. I never went back to that cabin. I never found out who or what was out there in the woods, pacing outside my door. But I do know one thing. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me. It followed me long after I left that place, and I'm not sure if it ever will. And I'll never forget that quiet, haunting moment when the footsteps stopped. The rain had started earlier in the evening, a soft drizzle that gradually turned into a heavy downpour by the time I made my way up the narrow, muddy trail leading to the cabin. I was on a solo trip, having decided to spend a week deep in the Amazon rainforest. The idea had come to me on a whim. Something about the isolation, the peace of being far from civilization, intrigued me. I wanted to clear my head, breathe air that wasn't tainted by city pollution, and just be alone with my thoughts. The cabin wasn't much, really. A small, wooden structure tucked away among towering trees, with a tin roof that would probably leak in the heaviest of rains. But it was exactly what I was looking for. No distractions, no noise. Just me and the wilderness. I had done my research before coming. There were no dangerous animals in the area. No predators that would take an interest in a lone human. But as I climbed up the slippery incline, the thought of being so far removed from any kind of help started to feel a little unsettling. Still, I pressed on, my boots squelching in the wet earth. When I finally arrived at the cabin, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. It wasn't wide open, just a sliver, but in that moment, it struck me as odd. I had locked it before leaving for my hike earlier in the day, and I was certain I hadn't left it open. I stepped forward cautiously, my heart rate picking up as the wind howled through the trees. The rain was now coming down in sheets, pounding the ground like 1,000 tiny hammers. I pushed the door open with one hand, keeping a tight grip on the handle, half expecting something, or someone, to be on the other side. Nothing. The room was empty, but a sense of unease settled over me, like a heavy blanket. I shrugged it off. Maybe the wind had caught the door and nudged it open. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The cabin smelled like wet wood and earth, the air thick with moisture. I locked the door behind me, taking a deep breath to steady myself. The place wasn't as bad as I had imagined. A small wood stove sat in one corner, a couple of chairs next to a low, rustic table, and a simple bed with a thick woolen blanket. A window on the far side of the cabin allowed just enough light to filter in, though the storm outside had already darkened the sky. I threw my bag on the bed, unzipping it to pull out a rain jacket. The wet weather was beginning to get to me, and I needed something warm to drink. I made my way over to the stove, collecting some firewood from the small pile near the door and setting it in the stove. I struck a match, the small flame flickering before it caught the dry wood. The crackle of the fire filled the room, and I felt a sense of comfort as the warmth began to spread. I poured myself a cup of tea from the thermos I had brought, sitting at the table to sip it slowly. But the quiet didn't last long. I kept hearing sounds, faint ones, like whispers carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, the way the storm and the trees combined to create strange noises. But as I listened more closely, it didn't seem like the wind at all. It sounded like footsteps. I froze, the cup halfway to my lips, my heart thudding in my chest. My first instinct was to check the door again to make sure it was still locked, but I resisted the urge. I told myself it was just the wind. I wasn't some paranoid person who jumped at shadows. But then there was a knock, a soft knock, almost too quiet to hear over the rain, but it was there. 3 taps, just enough to make my blood run cold. I stood up, my knees weak, and walked toward the door, every step feeling like it took longer than the last. I peered through the small window next to the door, but all I could see was darkness and sheets of rain obscuring everything beyond the cabin. The knocks came again, 3 more taps, but this time they were louder, more insistent. I backed away from the door, my thoughts racing. No one could have gotten here. The cabin was far off the main trail, and I hadn't passed anyone during my hike earlier. I didn't even have a neighbor for miles. Who was out there? I stayed where I was for a long moment, the fire crackling behind me. The rain continued to hammer against the roof, and the wind howled, but I couldn't hear anything else. No more knocks, no more footsteps, just the eerie quiet that followed the storm. My heart was still pounding, and my mind was spinning. Was someone playing a trick on me? Could someone have followed me here? I wasn't sure, but what I was sure of was that the isolation of this place suddenly felt suffocating. As I tried to make sense of everything, the cabin's walls creaked, and the wind seemed to pick up. Then, a loud bang, something hitting the roof, followed by more crashes. The storm had worsened. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, but it was hard to think clearly with my heart racing. I tried to convince myself that it was just nature, that I was overthinking things. But as the minutes stretched on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, was watching me. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and slowly crept to the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, taking one last glance through the window. Still nothing. No movement in the trees. Nothing out of the ordinary. Just as I was about to turn the knob, the door suddenly slammed open, nearly knocking me off my feet. I stumbled back, barely managing to catch myself as the wind rushed in, sending rainwater splashing across the floor. My heart skipped a beat as I stood frozen in the doorway, my breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. I couldn't move. I just stared out into the rain, the wind whipping my hair around my face. Then I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the cabin, a tall silhouette in the downpour, too still, too quiet. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel the presence. It was like nothing I had ever experienced. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually, the figure began to move. It wasn't fast, just a slow, deliberate walk toward the cabin. The steps were heavy, calculated, like someone who knew exactly what they were doing. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into the woods. I heard nothing but the roar of the storm and the crashing of the trees. My heart was racing. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands trembling. I backed away from the door, looking around the cabin for anything that could explain what had just happened. The rest of the night passed in a haze of fear and confusion. Couldn't sleep. Every sound, every creak of the cabin sent me into a frenzy. I kept thinking about the figure in the rain, wondering who or what it had been. But by morning, the rain had stopped. The sun shone weakly through the clouds, and the forest outside looked peaceful again, as if nothing had happened. The door was still locked. Nothing had been disturbed inside. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe the storm had made me paranoid. But as I stepped outside and looked around, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I turned back to the cabin and felt the weight of the isolation once again. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. The experience had left me with more questions than answers. Whatever it was that I had seen or thought I had seen had left a lasting impression. I stayed another night, but I didn't venture far from the cabin. I kept the doors and windows locked tight, and when I left the next day, I did so without looking back. The rain had cleared, but something had shifted in me. I had come to the Amazon seeking peace, but what I found instead was a stark reminder that nature doesn't care about human comfort. There are places in the world that are untouched by civilization, places where the earth still holds its mysteries, and not everything is meant to be understood. And sometimes, no matter how prepared you think you are, the wilderness can reveal things about yourself you never expected. It had been a while since I had gone back to my grandmother's cabin. She had passed a few years ago, and ever since, the cabin had been left untouched. My mom insisted I take a trip there, claiming it would help me clear my head. I wasn't so sure, but I knew my grandmother would have wanted me to take care of it. It was late fall when I finally decided to head out. The drive to the cabin took about 2 hours, winding through empty roads, with only the occasional car passing by. The trees were bare, and the sky was overcast, casting everything in a dim, almost eerie light. The weather had been getting worse, and by the time I turned off the main road, the wind had picked up. It had that kind of bite to it, like it was warning me. The cabin itself wasn't much. Small, rustic, a little run down, but it had a charm to it. A porch with a creaky rocking chair, an old wood stove in the corner, and a fireplace with a stack of logs neatly stacked beside it. It smelled like pine and damp earth, mixed with something earthy, a scent I hadn't noticed in years but somehow remembered clearly. The place felt frozen in time, still holding on to the warmth of my grandmother's presence. But there was something off about it, something I couldn't shake as I stepped inside. The silence was deafening, not the peaceful kind you expect in the woods, but an unsettling, heavy silence. As I placed my bags on the floor, I glanced around, half expecting to see her sitting in the corner, knitting. But the chair was empty, and the house felt colder than it should. I started a fire in the wood stove, hoping to chase off the chill, and made a cup of tea. Sitting down on the couch, I felt the weight of the day settle in. The quiet was starting to make my nerves fray. It was getting dark outside, and the wind had turned into a low, constant howl. I wrapped a blanket around myself, trying to ignore the sensation that I wasn't alone. It was the kind of feeling you get when you're being watched, but I told myself it was just the isolation of the place. The wind howled louder, rattling the windows, and the lights flickered. Then came the knock. At first, I thought it was the wind, or maybe an animal. But no, it came again. 3 sharp knocks on the door. My heart jumped. I wasn't expecting anyone, and there wasn't anyone around for miles. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the door, unsure of what to do. The knock came again, louder this time. My instincts screamed at me to hide, to lock the door, but I couldn't move. I slowly made my way to the door, glancing out the window beside it. Nothing but darkness. No sign of anyone. I opened the door just a crack, peering outside. Nothing. The wind was still howling, and the trees swayed, their branches creaking. But there was no one. I stepped outside, scanning the yard, but there was nothing but the faint outline of the woods in the distance. I told myself I had imagined it. Maybe it was an animal knocking something over, or the wind messing with my mind. But as I went back inside and locked the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. I checked the windows, pulled the curtains tight, and made sure the place was secure before sitting back down. The fire crackled in the stove, its warm glow the only light in the room. I tried to distract myself by reading, but every so often, I would glance at the door, expecting another knock. The night dragged on, and the storm outside only worsened. The wind whipped through the trees, and the rain started to pour down in sheets. The cabin groaned, settling into the rhythm of the storm. It wasn't until late in the evening, when I was nearly ready to sleep, that I heard it again. This time, it was a faint scraping sound, coming from the back of the cabin. I froze, listening, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was soft at first, almost like nails dragging across wood. Stopped, then started again, closer this time. Something or someone was outside. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made my way to the back door, my heart pounding in my chest. I stood still for a moment, listening. The wind was howling so loudly, it almost drowned out the sound. But then I heard it again, closer now, scraping against the wood. I swung the door open quickly, shining the flashlight around the yard. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, the stone path leading to the woodshed, but nothing else. I stepped outside, the cold biting into my skin. The air was thick with the smell of rain and wet earth. I shone the light along the side of the cabin, searching for any sign of movement. The scraping sound had stopped. For a moment, everything was still. Then I saw it, a shadow, fleeting in the corner of my eye. It moved, just out of the light's reach, heading toward the woodshed. I took a step forward, my pulse racing. The woodshed was old, decrepit, filled with tools and firewood, but it was the only place anyone could hide. I moved slowly, keeping my eyes on the shed. I could hear the wind rustling the branches, the occasional creak of the cabin behind me, but nothing else. The closer I got to the shed, the more the air seemed to shift. The temperature dropped, and my breath came out in misty puffs. I stopped in front of the shed, my flashlight now shaking in my hands. I reached for the door, hesitant, creaked loudly as I pulled it open. The light swept over the clutter inside, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. But there was nothing. I exhaled sharply, relieved but still tense. I was about to turn away when I heard it again, a soft shuffle from behind me. Before I could react, the door slammed shut. I spun around, the flashlight cutting through the dark, but there was no one there, no one in sight. My heart was in my throat, and I couldn't bring myself to move for a few moments. My mind raced with thoughts. Had I imagined it? Or was someone really out there, messing with me? I turned and ran back to the cabin, locking the door behind me once more. I pushed a chair in front of the door, a feeble attempt to keep whatever was out there from getting in. I spent the rest of the night on edge, unable to sleep. The wind howled outside, the storm raged on, and the only sound I could focus on was the pounding of my heart. Morning came eventually, bringing with it a bit of calm. The storm had passed, and the sun peeked through the clouds, casting a weak, golden light across the cabin. I didn't know what to make of the events of the night. Maybe it was just my nerves, or maybe I had been hearing things. But when I went to check the back of the cabin in the daylight, I saw it. A faint set of footprints, half covered in mud, leading from the woodshed to the edge of the woods. They were fresh. I left the cabin that morning, locking the door behind me, the sense of unease still lingering. I don't know who or what had been out there, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. It was the kind of night that felt like the earth had swallowed the sun entirely. The moon barely touched the sky, wrapped in thick clouds that seemed as though they were holding the night down. It was late in the autumn of 2003, somewhere in the backwoods of New England, far away from the bustling highways and streetlights of the cities. I had no business being there, not really. I didn't hunt, didn't know the woods like I should have. But when the opportunity to get away for a weekend in the mountains came, I took it. My cousin Mark had rented a cabin. He was an outdoorsman, big, strong, and a little rough around the edges. He was the kind of guy who knew how to survive in places like this, places where you couldn't rely on much except your own instincts. The cabin was secluded, nestled between the trees of a small graveyard that had been abandoned long before I was born. Most of the gravestones were faded, withering with age. Some of them were cracked, others just barely standing, as if they were tired of being remembered. It was a strange place for a cabin, but Mark seemed to think it was perfect. I had just finished unloading the car when the wind picked up, making the trees sway and groan in an eerie symphony. The cabin was a small wooden structure, old but sturdy. Mark had already started a fire in the fireplace, and the smell of burning pine drifted out into the chilly air. He stood by the door, his shadow stretching across the floor. "You'll get used to it," he said, eyes scanning the horizon. "The woods, the graveyard, It's just part of the landscape around here. I wasn't sure I wanted to get used to it, but I nodded, forcing a smile. I took a deep breath and stepped into the cabin, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. The moment I stepped inside, something about the place felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. It wasn't the graveyard that bothered me. It was the stillness. The air felt thick, as if it had been waiting for something to happen. The fire crackled and popped, sending shadows dancing along the wooden walls. Mark went about unpacking his gear, getting settled in as if we were in some ordinary place. I stood by the window, looking out at the graveyard that stretched out behind the cabin. The moonless night turned the gravestones into barely visible shapes against the trees. After a while, Mark told me he was going to bed, but I wasn't tired. I decided to take a walk around the cabin, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. The wind had picked up even more by then, and the trees groaned and whispered, making the night feel alive in a way I didn't like. The graveyard was even stranger up close. Some of the tombstones had been knocked over, others had sunken into the earth, as if the land itself was reclaiming them. I walked along the narrow path that led through the graveyard, the crunch of dry leaves beneath my boots the only sound breaking the silence. My eyes kept darting back to the cabin, feeling that familiar unease creeping in. Something wasn't right. The wind howled again, making the trees sway wildly. I could hear the sound of something snapping in the distance, like a branch breaking. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker at the edge of my vision, but when I turned, I saw a figure standing among the gravestones, staring right at me. I froze. The figure was tall, nearly hidden by the shadows of the trees, but I could make out the outline of a man. The way he stood, so still and unmoving, felt unnatural. I called out, but my voice barely broke through the wind. "Hello!" I felt ridiculous, but the words were all I could manage. There was no response. I took a step forward, but the figure didn't move. Another snap of a branch broke the silence, and my heart skipped a beat. The figure had disappeared. I whipped my head around, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The only thing I saw was the graveyard, the wind tossing the branches around like angry arms reaching for me. I turned and ran back to the cabin, slamming the door behind me. My breath was ragged as I leaned against the wall, trying to calm myself. Mark was still in his room, and the cabin was quiet again, almost too quiet. The next morning, the air felt different, lighter, almost peaceful, but there was still that unease hanging over me. I tried to push the memory of last night out of my head as Mark and I set out for a hike deeper into the woods. The silence of the graveyard and the figure still lingered in my thoughts, but I said nothing to Mark. He was already starting to make fun of me, calling me a city kid too soft for the woods. But when we returned to the cabin that afternoon, things began to take a darker turn. Mark was the first to notice it. He had stepped out back to get more wood for the fire and came back looking unusually pale. "You need to come with me," he said, his voice tight. I followed him without questioning, still unsure of what was going on. Out in the graveyard, something had changed. There were fresh footprints in the dirt, leading from the edge of the forest, across the graveyard, and straight up to the back of the cabin. They were large, deep prints, like someone had been wearing heavy boots. "Do you see this?" Mark asked, pointing at the ground. "These tracks weren't here this morning. Hell, I didn't even see them when we left for the hike." I didn't want to think about what it meant. My mind raced as I looked at the tracks. The idea of someone walking around our cabin while we were gone sent a chill through me. Mark was looking around, eyes scanning the trees. "Stay close," he said. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by something darker, something I had never seen in him before. We circled the graveyard, walking between the crooked tombstones, keeping our distance from the edge of the forest. The tracks led to a small thicket of trees behind the graveyard, but there was nothing there. No sign of anyone, just the deepening shadows as the sun began to dip below the horizon. That night, as the fire crackled in the cabin, the unease that had been building inside me finally broke. Mark had gone to bed early again, but I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, staring out into the graveyard, watching the way the shadows seemed to move, like something was just beyond them. The wind had died down, and all I could hear was the occasional rustle of leaves. My eyes kept flicking back to the graveyard. Then I saw something, a figure standing in the middle of the graveyard again. The same tall, still shape from last night. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my flashlight and ran out the door. My heart pounded as I moved toward the graveyard, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness. As I reached the first row of gravestones, I called out again, my voice trembling in the still night air. "Hello!" I shouted, hoping it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the figure didn't move. I approached it slowly, my hands trembling as I raised the flashlight higher. And then I saw it, the face, or what should have been a face. The skin was stretched too tight, pale, and almost translucent. The eyes were hollow, empty spaces, black holes staring straight through me. The figure took a step forward, and I froze, unable to move. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The figure reached for me, slow, deliberate, and I knew in that instant that I wasn't looking at a person. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything from this world. I turned and ran back to the cabin, slamming the door behind me. I could hear something following me, the soft shuffling of feet, but when I looked out the window, there was nothing there. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, eyes fixed on the door, the flashlight in my hand, waiting for the first sign of daylight. By morning, the figure was gone, but the tracks were still there, leading into the graveyard and then disappearing into the woods. We left the cabin early, without speaking much. Mark was quiet, but I could see the same unease in his eyes. As we drove away, I glanced back once, just once, at the graveyard. The trees stood like silent sentinels, and the gravestones seemed to watch us leave. I never went back to that cabin. The unease, the fear, still lingers, but the one thing that stays with me more than anything is the memory of that thing, standing in the graveyard. It wasn't human. It wasn't alive. And I can't shake the feeling that, one day, it'll be waiting for me again. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, just me and a couple of close friends. We'd rented a small cabin nestled deep in the woods of North Carolina, far from the buzz of city life. There was no phone signal, no internet, nothing but the trees and the chirping of insects. It sounded perfect at the time, a place to escape and unwind. It was just one of those weekends where you expect nothing to go wrong, just the kind of time you can turn off your brain and let yourself breathe. I'm not the type of person to jump to conclusions, to get paranoid over things. I've gone camping and spent plenty of time in remote places before, but this weekend would change my view of things. The cabin, although quaint and well-kept, was isolated, perched on a slight incline overlooking a small, fast-moving stream. The forest around it was dense, the trees tall and ancient-looking, their bark dark and rough. In the daylight, it was serene, almost calming in its stillness. But that first night, as the sun sank and the shadows stretched, I began to feel something wasn't quite right. The sun had set and a heavy silence fell over the cabin. We were inside, gathered around the fireplace, playing cards and drinking beer. The kind of simple fun you have when you're away from everything. There was no rush, no agenda. The night was ours to spend however we pleased. I remember feeling oddly restless, though. Maybe it was the quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you notice every little sound. The crackling fire, the occasional shift in a chair, the way the wind would catch the branches outside. But there was something else, something I couldn't put my finger on, a tension that I couldn't quite shake. "Hey, you guys notice how quiet it is out there?" Mark said, breaking the silence. Mark was the kind of guy who made light of everything. Big, loud, always cracking jokes. But even his tone was off now, almost too casual. "It's the woods, man," I said, trying to dismiss it. "Of course it's quiet. You'll hear a lot of that out here. It's just the night." But still, there was something in the air, a heaviness that didn't belong. I could feel it crawling over my skin, like a soft whisper I couldn't fully hear but could definitely sense. We finished the game, and soon enough, the fire began to die down. Mark was the first to head upstairs to bed, followed by my other friend, Lacey. I stayed behind, sitting by the fireplace, letting the embers flicker low and cast long, orange shadows on the walls. My mind kept wandering back to that feeling, that sense of unease that kept creeping up on me. Then it came, the sound. First, I thought it was just the wind. The trees outside seemed to groan with it. But then, I realized it wasn't wind. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. A sound coming from somewhere near the edge of the property, just beyond where the trees became thick and impenetrable. It sounded like something was moving through the woods. Heavy footsteps, but it didn't seem quite right. The steps were too spaced out, almost like someone was trying to walk quietly but wasn't doing a very good job of it. I stood up from my chair, feeling the cold air brushing against my skin as I moved toward the window. The glass was fogged up from the warmth inside, but I wiped it with my sleeve and peered out into the darkness. Nothing, just the trees. But the feeling of being watched, of being observed, hadn't left. It was like someone or something was out there, just beyond the reach of the light, waiting. I convinced myself that it was nothing, that my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe it was a deer or some other animal. After all, the woods were full of wildlife. I turned away from the window, ready to head upstairs and get some sleep. And then I heard it again. This time it was closer. I could hear the crunch of leaves beneath heavy footsteps, the way the ground shifted under the weight. This wasn't an animal. I froze. My heart slammed against my chest. I couldn't breathe for a second. I moved slowly toward the door, glancing back up at the stairs. Should I wake them up? Should I tell someone? No, that would seem ridiculous. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I grabbed the small flashlight we had left on the counter and crept outside. The cold air hit me like a slap, making me shiver. My breath came out in little puffs, almost like I was exhaling smoke. I moved carefully, my eyes scanning the trees, the ground. There were no obvious signs of anything. No footprints, no signs of anything moving around. Just the wind, the rustling of the leaves. But there was something unsettling about the space around me. The way it felt empty, hollow, as if the air itself had been sucked out. Suddenly, I heard a crack, a loud snap of twigs breaking. My heart skipped a beat, and I swung the flashlight around, its beam cutting through the darkness. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a shadow darting between the trees, too quick to really catch. My stomach dropped. I rushed back inside and locked the door behind me, my breath coming fast and shallow. I moved toward the stairs, but I froze halfway up. Mark and Lacey were already standing at the top of the stairs, their faces pale and tense. "You hear that?" Mark asked, his voice low and urgent. "I think so," I replied. "What was that?" Lacey's face was white, her eyes wide. "It's not just me, right? I heard someone out there." We all stood in silence for a moment, listening. The house felt like a trap now. The walls seemed to close in. The darkness outside felt more menacing. I didn't know what to do. We couldn't leave. Not in the middle of the night, not with the storm rolling in. The roads would be impassable soon. And then, there it was again. A noise soft, like a twig snapping, came from the back of the cabin, just beyond the small porch. I moved to the window and peered out. Nothing but blackness. But I felt it again, the feeling of being watched. And just as I turned to move away, I saw it. A figure, barely visible in the darkness, standing at the edge of the trees. It wasn't moving. It was just there, watching. My blood ran cold. I grabbed Mark by the arm. "We need to leave. Now." But before we could make a move, the figure stepped forward. Slowly, methodically. It didn't run. It didn't hurry. It just walked toward the cabin, its silhouette becoming clearer in the dim light from the porch. The figure was tall, too tall, its movements stiff, almost unnatural. The three of us stood frozen, staring at the figure. It was just outside the reach of the light, but it was so close now. I could see its features more clearly. A man, his face shadowed, unshaven, his clothes ragged and torn. But there was something wrong about him. His eyes, they were wide, almost too wide. The pupils dilated as if he'd been in the dark for too long. I didn't know what he wanted. I didn't know who he was. But I knew one thing. He wasn't just a wanderer lost in the woods. Something was wrong, dead wrong. I bolted for the door, but Mark grabbed me. "Wait," he whispered. "Don't do anything stupid. We have to get out of here," I said, my voice trembling. We moved as quietly as we could, avoiding making noise. I could hear the figure getting closer, his footsteps crunching on the gravel path. He was almost at the door now. We couldn't outrun him. We couldn't hide. But we had one thing he didn't: a plan. I grabbed the keys from the counter, unlocked the door, and we rushed outside, running toward the truck. As we got in, the figure finally made it to the porch, standing motionless in the dim light. I slammed the door shut and started the engine, peeling out of the driveway, the truck's tires screeching on the dirt road. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I just kept my foot on the gas, speeding down the road, away from the cabin, away from whatever that thing was. We didn't stop until we were miles away, out of the woods. We never spoke a word about what happened that night. We didn't have to. We all knew. The man in the woods was still out there, and he wasn't alone. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the dense woods as I trudged up the narrow dirt path to the park ranger cabin. My boots crunched against the fallen leaves, the familiar sound a constant companion in the silence of the forest. It was late October, and the trees were starting to shed their fiery red and orange leaves. The air had that crisp bite to it, a sign that winter was slowly making its approach. I, Owen Grady, had been a park ranger for nearly a decade, stationed here in the Catoosa Wildlife Reserve in northern Arkansas. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it was one that kept me grounded, one that allowed me to escape from the noise of the world and the noise in my head. I loved the solitude the job brought, but lately, something had been off. A sense of unease had settled over me like a heavy blanket, and no matter how many hours I spent patrolling the woods, I couldn't shake it. The cabin itself wasn't much, just a small, single-room structure tucked deep in the woods. It was built years ago by the Park Service, a shelter for rangers on duty during the colder months. It had a wood stove, a few basic comforts, and a window that looked out over the vast forest that seemed to stretch on forever. The forest was wild and untamed, and it felt like the only thing separating me from that wildness was the cabin and the safety it provided. But recently, the safety had started to feel less certain. The first few days had been quiet, as they usually were. The wildlife was moving slower now, preparing for the coming winter, and there were fewer tourists, fewer hikers, and fewer campers. I liked it that way. Fewer people meant fewer problems. I would spend the days walking the trails, checking for anything out of place, and spending the evenings by the stove, reading or just staring out the window. It wasn't exciting, but it was peaceful. That peace shattered a week ago. It was just after sunset when I heard it for the first time. A rustling sound, faint but distinct, just outside the cabin. At first, I assumed it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, something curious about the cabin. But when I glanced out the window, I saw nothing. I chalked it up to the wind. The woods had a way of playing tricks on your mind when you were out here alone for too long. But then it happened again the next night, and the night after that. The rustling outside my cabin wasn't constant, but it was persistent. It would start around the same time, just after the sun dipped below the horizon, and continue until well into the night. Sometimes it sounded like footsteps. Sometimes it was more like something brushing up against the cabin walls. I couldn't explain it, but I knew one thing for sure. Something was out there. I wasn't exactly scared, but there was a knot in my stomach every time the sun began to set. I kept my rifle nearby just in case. It wasn't unusual to encounter animals in the woods. Bears, coyotes, even the occasional mountain lion. But I had lived here long enough to know the difference between an animal and something else. This was different. The way it moved, the way it circled the cabin, the way it never seemed to stop. It didn't feel like anything I'd encountered before. On the fourth night, it got worse. I had been sitting by the stove, the warmth of the fire a small comfort against the growing chill outside. The fire crackled, and I was lost in my thoughts when I heard it again. A rustling sound, this time closer. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up, my boots hitting the floor with a sharp thud, and moved toward the window. Through the frosted glass, I could just make out the outline of something moving near the edge of the trees. The shape was too large to be a deer, too erratic to be a bear. I watched it for what felt like an eternity, waiting for it to make a move. My hand instinctively reached for the rifle on the wall. I'd never had a reason to fire it before, but tonight felt different. The figure moved again, closer now. My breath caught in my throat. It was a man, or at least it looked like a man, tall with broad shoulders and dressed in dark clothing. He stood just outside the cabin, as if waiting for something. He was still unmoving, like he didn't even know I was watching him. I took a step back from the window, my mind racing. What was he doing out here? There wasn't anyone else in the reserve this time of year, and even if there were, they wouldn't be wandering this close to my cabin in the dead of night. I was alone, and I didn't recognize him. I hesitated, my finger tightening around the rifle. Should I confront him? Should I call for help? I knew better than to go outside without a plan, but I also knew that there was no one to help me if things went south. The closest town was over an hour away, and the ranger station didn't exactly have a quick response time. I waited for him to move, to give me some indication of his intentions, but he didn't. He stood there, staring at the cabin, unmoving. The silence was maddening. I had no idea what he was waiting for, but the tension was unbearable. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. I couldn't tell anymore. The fire in the stove had burned down to embers, and the cabin was growing colder. I needed to make a decision. Slowly, I crept toward the door, careful not to make any noise. The last thing I wanted was for him to know I was watching. I cracked the door open, just wide enough to slip outside. The night air hit me like a slap, sharp and biting. I could see the figure more clearly now. He hadn't moved an inch. He was still staring at the cabin, but there was something in the way he stood that sent a chill through me. I didn't know what he wanted, but I knew I wasn't going to find out the hard way. I closed the door quietly behind me, bolting it shut. There was a thin line of light from the crack around the door, and I stood in the dark, listening, waiting. I didn't hear any footsteps. I didn't hear him move. After what felt like an eternity, I finally dared to glance out the window again. He was gone. No sign of him, no sound, nothing. Just the quiet of the woods, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I stood there for a long time, trying to steady my breath, trying to make sense of what had happened. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Who was he? What was he doing out here? And why hadn't he done anything? For the next few days, I didn't see him again. The rustling outside the cabin stopped. The woods felt quiet, almost unnervingly so. But that didn't make me feel safe. If anything, it made me feel more unsettled. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting. It wasn't until a week later that I finally got the confirmation I dreaded. I was out patrolling the perimeter of the cabin, checking the old logging trails that ran through the reserve when I stumbled upon something. A set of footprints, large and deep, carved into the soft earth. They were fresh. I knelt down to examine them, my stomach sinking. They weren't animal prints. They were human, but the tracks didn't make sense. They led off the trail, deeper into the woods, and then stopped, like whoever had made them had vanished into thin air. No sign of a struggle, no blood, just a set of tracks that disappeared into the wilderness. That was when I realized the truth. I wasn't alone out here. Whoever had been lurking around my cabin, whoever had been circling it night after night, had been watching me. But they hadn't attacked. They hadn't done anything. They were waiting for something, and I wasn't sure what that was. But I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I packed my things that night. I didn't want to stay in that cabin anymore, not with the knowledge that someone was out there, someone who knew the land better than I did. I left the stove burning, the door locked, and the rifle behind. I made my way down the trail, the cold wind biting at my face, the forest stretching out before me. I didn't know if the person who had been watching me was still out there or if they were long gone, but I wasn't taking any chances. By the time I reached the ranger station, the sun was starting to rise. The forest was peaceful once more, the silence almost welcoming in its familiarity. But I knew better. There was no such thing as peace when you were being hunted. I never went back to that cabin, never even considered it. The Park Service eventually took it down, and the reserve became even more remote. But sometimes, on quiet nights, when the wind rustles through the trees, I still wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed. And if the person who had been watching me is still out there, somewhere in the woods, waiting. I never got the answers, but I knew one thing for sure. The woods have a way of hiding things, and sometimes it's better not to look too closely. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip to the cabin in the woods. A weekend to escape the stresses of everyday life, to unwind and do some fishing. Just me and my old gym partner, Mark. We'd both been working long hours at the office, and this seemed like the perfect getaway. The cabin was remote, tucked away on the outskirts of a small town about 3 hours from where we lived. No distractions, no city noise, just quiet. The cabin itself was old, wooden, with a creaky porch and faded brown paint that had long ago chipped away from the walls. It wasn't a luxury retreat, but it was cozy enough, with a fireplace, a couple of worn-out couches, and a kitchen stocked with the essentials. The place had a history too. I had heard stories from Mark that it belonged to his grandfather, who had passed it down to Mark's father. There were a lot of old tools and photographs, some of them dating back to the early 1900s, hidden away in the attic. Nothing creepy about it, just some family history. We arrived on Friday evening, just as the sun dipped behind the trees. The air was cool, and the forest surrounding the cabin looked peaceful, almost serene. We spent the night drinking beer and talking about the old days when we'd worked out together in the gym, reminiscing about the ridiculous things we used to do for fun. Mark was always the joker, the type of guy who could make anyone laugh, and I had always been more of the serious type. But tonight, I let loose. We both needed it. It wasn't until the next morning, when the fog rolled in thick across the woods, that things started to feel off. The weather had taken a turn. It wasn't just the usual early morning mist. It felt heavier, almost suffocating. We decided to go for a hike, hoping it would clear our heads. We grabbed our gear and set off through the dense forest, following the narrow, winding trail that led to a small lake Mark's father used to take him to when he was younger. As we walked, I noticed that the woods seemed quieter than usual. The birds weren't chirping, and there was no sound of rustling leaves. It felt as though the entire forest was holding its breath. Mark was up ahead, joking about something, but I wasn't paying much attention. My mind kept wandering. There was something about the stillness of the woods that unsettled me. We reached the lake by mid-morning. It was beautiful, serene, with the sun just starting to break through the clouds, casting a golden light over the water. We set up a couple of camp chairs and unpacked our gear, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow near the edge of the trees, standing still. I didn't say anything to Mark. Maybe it was a deer or some other animal. But as I squinted, I realized the shape wasn't moving. It was too still, too human-shaped. My heart started to race, but I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was nothing. Mark noticed I was acting strange and asked if I was okay. I nodded, not wanting to worry him. He was still his usual self, completely at ease. The mist from earlier hadn't fully cleared, and the air felt damp and heavy. I tried to focus on the lake, but every few seconds, my eyes darted back toward the trees, where the shadow had been. Then it was gone. I didn't know whether it had been my imagination, but the sensation of being watched lingered. I was so distracted that I didn't even notice Mark getting up and walking toward the water. He was talking about something, but I wasn't listening. I turned my head again, and that's when I saw it, clear as day, a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, staring directly at me. A tall, thin man, wearing a jacket, his face hidden in the shadows. His posture was rigid, unnatural. This time I couldn't ignore it. My pulse quickened. I called out to Mark, but he was already too far away, absorbed in the lake. I stood up, taking a few steps forward. The man didn't move. My heart pounded as I stared at him, unsure of what to do. I wasn't sure if he was just another hiker or someone who had wandered into the woods, but something about him felt wrong, off. He was far enough away that I couldn't make out any details about his face, but I knew something wasn't right. Without thinking, I grabbed my phone, trying to take a picture, but the camera wouldn't focus. It was like the air itself was distorting around him, warping everything. I felt a cold sweat form on the back of my neck as I took a few cautious steps back toward the cabin. The man didn't move, but I could feel his presence, like a weight pressing against me. I turned to Mark, who was still kneeling by the water, oblivious. "Mark," I called, louder this time, and he looked up, giving me a strange, confused look. "What is it?" he asked, standing up and brushing dirt from his knees. "Someone's out there," I said, my voice shaking. He looked in the direction I was pointing, but there was nothing there. The man had disappeared. It was like he had melted into the fog. "Are you sure?" Mark asked, coming over to me with a skeptical look. "Maybe you're just seeing things. It's the fog, you know?" I didn't know what to say. I couldn't explain it, but I knew what I'd seen. I could still feel the weight of his gaze, even though he was gone. We returned to the cabin that afternoon, the eerie feeling still lingering in the back of my mind. Mark didn't seem to take it seriously, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. We spent the rest of the day inside, playing cards and drinking beers. By the time the sun set, the woods outside were pitch black, and the air had grown colder. We decided to get some rest. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, set my nerves on edge. I kept hearing something. Footsteps, soft and distant, almost like someone was walking around the cabin. I told myself it was just the wind, but I couldn't help but check the windows every few minutes. Mark was snoring beside me, completely oblivious. Then I heard it. A knock, light, almost imperceptible, at the front door. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and I held my breath, waiting for more sounds. I didn't move. Another knock, this time a little louder, followed by a faint scraping noise. It sounded like someone dragging something heavy across the porch. I slowly got out of bed, trying not to make a sound, and crept toward the window. I peeked out but saw nothing. The porch was empty. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. Was it the man I'd seen earlier? Or was it someone else? I didn't know what to think. The knocking continued, growing louder, more insistent. It was coming from the back door now. I grabbed my phone, trying to call Mark, but the signal was spotty. There was no reception out here, not this deep in the woods. I had no way of contacting anyone. The thought of being completely isolated made my skin crawl. The knocking stopped suddenly. There was nothing but the sound of the wind rustling the trees. For a moment, I thought maybe it had been my imagination, but then I heard something else, scratching at the door, like nails against wood. My blood ran cold. I grabbed a heavy flashlight from the kitchen and slowly made my way to the back door. The house felt unnaturally silent now, every creak and groan of the old wood amplifying in the stillness. I turned the handle slowly, my heart racing. When I opened the door, I almost wished I hadn't. There, lying in front of the door, was a body. A man's body, bloodied and contorted in a grotesque position, as if he had been dragged across the porch. His face was barely recognizable, covered in dirt and blood. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly into the night. I staggered back, my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It didn't make sense. How had he gotten here? Where had he come from? Panic set in. I slammed the door shut and bolted it, my hands trembling as I leaned against it. I could still hear the faint sounds of something moving outside, the scraping noise again. But this time I knew there was something out there, and it was not going to leave until it had what it wanted. I don't know how long I stayed there, trying to keep calm, trying to make sense of it all. But all I knew for sure was that I was trapped. And if the body outside wasn't a warning, I wasn't sure what was. The next morning, I drove into town to call the police. When they arrived at the cabin, they found the body, but it was gone. There was no trace of the man. No blood, no evidence. It was like he had never been there at all. Mark still didn't believe me, but I knew what I had seen. The feeling of being watched, the knocks at the door, the body, it was all too real. I never went back to that cabin, and I never went camping again. It was late October, the air was cold, and the forest had an almost suffocating stillness to it. I wasn't sure what I had been expecting when I decided to stay at the old cabin, but it definitely wasn't this. The place was far out in the woods, miles away from the nearest town, and the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like a poor choice. But I needed some time to myself, away from everything, and I had found this cabin online. Secluded, quiet, and for rent at a price too good to pass up. The cabin itself was weathered, the wooden exterior gray and peeling. The front porch sagged. The boards creaked under my weight as I stepped inside. The door, an old heavy thing with rusted hinges, shut behind me with a deep, resounding thud. Inside, the air was stale, and a musty smell of old wood and mildew hung thick. The furniture was sparse and outdated, as if it hadn't been touched in years. A fireplace sat at one end of the room, but there was no wood for a fire, and it looked like it hadn't been used in ages. I made my way upstairs, hoping the second floor would be more comfortable. The stairs groaned under my feet, and the floorboards above seemed unstable, as though they could collapse at any moment. I finally found my way into a small bedroom. It had an old metal bed frame with a worn mattress covered in yellowed sheets, a small dresser, and a chair near the window. The window itself was filthy, but I could see the dense trees that surrounded the cabin, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. It was beautiful in a way, but eerie too, the kind of beauty that makes you feel like you're being watched. I tried to shake off the unease creeping into my thoughts. I had been alone before, and this wasn't the first time I'd stayed in a place like this. It was just the isolation, I told myself. The feeling of being so far removed from anything familiar. The forest was unnaturally quiet, and as the hours went by, that silence began to press in on me. Around nightfall, I decided to explore the land a little. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The cool evening air brushed against my face, the chill making me regret not grabbing a jacket. The path leading from the cabin wound around a hill, with trees so dense that I couldn't see much more than a few feet in front of me. The flashlight's beam bounced off of branches and rocks, casting strange shadows. The further I went, the more I could hear the creak and groan of the trees in the wind. But there were no birds, no animals, not even the sound of insects. It was like the entire forest was holding its breath. I came across an old barn a few hundred yards from the cabin. The door was wide open, and it looked as though it had been abandoned for years. Curiosity got the better of me, so I walked inside. The barn smelled of old hay and rot, and the floor was covered in dust. Empty shelves lined the walls, some of them still holding old, rusted tools. But what caught my attention was the far corner, where something was half covered by a tattered cloth. I slowly approached it, my heart starting to beat faster in my chest. The cloth was heavy, and as I pulled it back, I felt a wave of coldness wash over me. There, lying in the corner, was an old, cracked mirror. It looked out of place, like it had no business being in a barn. I was about to turn away when I saw something in the reflection. A figure standing behind me. I whipped around, but the barn was empty. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt an icy sensation crawl up my spine. I quickly backed out of the barn, my heart pounding in my chest, and slammed the door shut behind me. I didn't know what I had seen, or if it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but something didn't feel right. That mirror, that figure in the reflection, it felt too real. I rushed back to the cabin, hoping that being inside would calm my nerves. The darkness was settling in, and the wind picked up again, making the trees sway and creak. The house felt colder now, and the silence was even more oppressive. I tried to settle in front of the fireplace, but without wood, I couldn't get it going. The only warmth was from a small space heater that was barely doing the job. That's when I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible knock at the door. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. The knock was deliberate, as though someone or something was standing outside, waiting. My heart rate spiked, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I stood frozen, not sure if I should open the door or ignore it. The knock came again, louder this time. I knew I wasn't imagining it. I was sure of that. The decision to open the door felt like the wrong one, but something compelled me to do it anyway. I slowly walked to the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. The cold of the metal burned my palm as I twisted it open. The door creaked on its hinges as it swung open to reveal nothing but the pitch-black night. The trees swayed in the wind, but there was no sign of anyone. I stood there for a moment, waiting for something to happen, for something to appear in the darkness. But nothing did. I stepped back inside, locking the door behind me, but the unease didn't go away. I tried to push the feeling aside, tried to tell myself it was nothing, just my nerves playing tricks on me. I turned off the lights and sat in the dark, listening to the wind howl outside. Then, another knock. This time, it was coming from the back of the cabin. I felt a chill run through my body, and I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the flashlight and hurried to the back door. I opened it quickly, scanning the yard. But just like before, there was nothing. I felt a strange sense of dread wash over me, and I quickly shut the door again. The night seemed to stretch on forever after that. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every creak of the wood, every whisper of the wind felt like it was part of something much darker, something much more dangerous. But as the hours dragged on, the knocks stopped. The air grew still, and the silence became unbearable. My eyes grew heavy, and I eventually drifted into an uneasy sleep, haunted by dreams of shadows and things I couldn't quite understand. When I woke up, the sun was just beginning to rise. The cabin was quiet, almost too quiet. The air felt different, lighter. But as I went about packing my things to leave, I found something odd. The mirror from the barn. It was sitting in the corner of the living room, covered in the same cloth I had seen it with the night before. I froze. How could it have gotten inside? There was no way. I had locked the door, I had checked every room. There was no explanation. The reflection in the mirror seemed to shift, like the image wasn't quite right. I could see myself, but behind me, I saw something else. A figure, standing in the dark corner of the room, watching me. I didn't wait to see more. I grabbed my bag, ran out of the cabin, and didn't stop until I reached my car. I didn't look back as I drove away, not even when the woods faded into the distance. To this day, I have no idea what I saw. I don't know if it was the isolation playing tricks on my mind or something else entirely, but I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. And I'm certain, absolutely certain, that whatever was in that mirror, whatever was knocking at the door, wasn't just my imagination. It was something real. It had been a long week of work, and the exhaustion was starting to catch up with me. The opportunity to take a weekend getaway was too tempting to pass up. So I packed my things and set off for a small cabin in the woods I'd found online. It promised a quiet, peaceful escape, far from the noise and stress of everyday life. I didn't really expect anything out of the ordinary to happen, just some solitude and a chance to reset. The cabin was located a couple of hours outside of the city, nestled deep in a forested area. The roads were narrow, and I had to rely on GPS to find my way. It wasn't exactly easy to get to, but that was the point. I wanted to get away from everything, to be disconnected from the world for a while. The last stretch of road leading to the cabin was a rough dirt path, overgrown with weeds and trees. The kind of place you'd expect to be empty for miles around. When I finally arrived, I was surprised at how remote it really was. There were no neighbors nearby, no signs of life, just the deep, quiet woods surrounding me. The cabin itself looked weathered but sturdy enough, with a small porch and a single, large window that overlooked a small clearing. It seemed cozy, almost charming in its simplicity. The kind of place I imagined would be perfect for some reflection and relaxation. Inside, the cabin was basic but comfortable. A small kitchen, a few chairs around a table, a couch, and a fireplace dominated the space. There was a lofted bedroom above, accessible by a set of steep stairs. The place had that typical smell of wood and old furniture, like something you'd expect in a cabin that hadn't seen too many visitors over the years. I settled in quickly, unpacking my things and starting a small fire in the stove. The night was approaching, and the forest outside started to darken, the sun sinking behind the tall trees. There was no electricity, but the fire provided enough light to get comfortable. I'd planned to stay for the weekend, with no particular agenda, just some time to myself. The first night was calm. I spent it reading by the fire, enjoying the warmth and the sound of the crackling wood. The only noise outside was the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. The peace was refreshing, and I was starting to think maybe I'd found the perfect place to relax. But as the night wore on, I began to notice things. Small things at first. The way the shadows in the corners of the cabin seemed to move, even though I knew it was just the flickering of the firelight. The distant sound of something large moving through the forest, too far off to make out clearly, but close enough to make me wonder what could be out there. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself it was just the wind or some small animal. By the time I went to bed, I was feeling a bit uneasy. The bed was comfortable enough, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin's old wood, every crackle of the fire from downstairs, kept me on edge. I kept hearing noises, whispers, almost as if someone was out there, moving around the cabin. Eventually, I drifted off into a restless sleep, but it didn't last long. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up with a start, feeling like something was wrong. I could hear footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. My heart started to race. There was no way anyone should be out here. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and I hadn't seen a single car on the road when I arrived. I stayed as still as I could, listening, hoping it was just my imagination. But the footsteps continued, moving around the cabin, as if someone was checking the perimeter. I couldn't tell if they were coming closer or moving away, but the sound was unmistakable. I grabbed my phone, trying to get some light, but there was no signal. Of course, there wasn't. I'd known this would be the case when I'd booked the place, but in that moment, it felt like a mistake. I thought about grabbing something for protection, but the cabin didn't have much in the way of weapons, just the fire poker beside the stove and a few knives in the kitchen. I had no idea what kind of person or people might be out there. I decided to wait it out. Maybe it was just an animal or something harmless. But the more I thought about it, the less convinced I became. The footsteps weren't the kind you'd expect from an animal. They were too steady, too purposeful, and they kept circling, as if someone was trying to figure out the best way to approach. Hours seemed to pass in the dark, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. But by the time the footsteps finally stopped, I was too scared to move. I stayed there, wide awake, listening for anything else. It felt like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. When morning finally came, I cautiously went downstairs, not sure what to expect. The fire had long since died out, leaving the cabin cold and empty. Outside, the sun had risen, but the woods still felt eerie, as if they were holding some kind of secret. I stepped outside to check the area around the cabin, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints in the dirt, no signs of life at all. I told myself it had been nothing, just my imagination, or maybe the wind playing tricks on me. But the unease lingered. I decided to stick it out for the rest of the weekend, figuring that whatever had happened, it was over now. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but that night, as I sat by the fire once again, the silence felt different. It wasn't the comforting silence I'd experienced the first night. It was oppressive, suffocating, as if the woods themselves were watching me. The crackling of the fire didn't seem as soothing anymore. It only added to the tension. I went to bed early that night, hoping to escape the growing dread. But I didn't sleep, couldn't. Every small noise, every shift of the wood in the walls, sent me into a state of alertness. I could hear breathing now, just faintly soft, steady, like someone standing just outside the window. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was the wind or something natural, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something human, watching. The footsteps returned in the night, but this time, they were different. They weren't circling the cabin anymore. They were coming toward the door. I heard them slow, stop, and then a knock. Slow, deliberate, a single knock on the door. My heart pounded in my chest, my hands trembling. Couldn't move, couldn't speak. I stayed as still as possible, holding my breath, hoping whoever it was would go away. The knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. I wanted to call out, to demand to know who it was, but the words wouldn't come. My throat was tight with fear, my body frozen. Whoever was out there was not leaving. Eventually, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I didn't know how long I sat there in the dark, not moving, listening for any sign that someone was still outside. But when I finally worked up the courage to look outside, there was nothing. The night was quiet again, just the rustle of the trees in the wind and the occasional crackle from the fire. I didn't know what to think. Had I imagined it all? Had someone really been outside? Or had it been the mind playing tricks on me? I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew something had been there. By morning, I decided I couldn't stay any longer. I packed my things quickly, every noise outside making my heart race, and left the cabin without looking back. When I reached the road and started driving, I felt a strange sense of relief. It was over, but as I turned onto the main road, I noticed something odd in the rearview mirror. A shadow in the trees, standing still, just out of sight. I didn't stop to find out who or what it was. I just drove faster, and as I got further from the cabin, I finally let myself breathe again. But as the miles passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't been alone that weekend, that whatever had been out there in the woods was still watching, and that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't quite done with me yet. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, something to clear my head. I hadn't been to the mountains in years, and after all the noise in my life, work, city, and relationships, I needed some peace, a break from the constant hum, a breath of fresh air. So, when my old friend Will invited me to join him for a weekend trip to his family's cabin in the mountains of Utah, I didn't think twice. The cabin was secluded, far from any town, surrounded by miles of untouched wilderness. Will had been there dozens of times as a kid. Now in our mid-30s, he said it would be the perfect place to unwind. Just the two of us, no distractions, no one else. I didn't have anything going on, so I agreed. I packed up some clothes, grabbed my hunting gear, and hit the road. The drive was long, hours through winding roads, up the slopes of rugged hills and past valleys that seemed to stretch on forever. It was late afternoon when I finally pulled up to the cabin, a modest two-story structure with wooden beams and a tin roof. It looked weathered, a bit beaten down by the elements, but that's what gave it its charm. The land around it was a vast expanse of trees, low brush, and rocky hillsides. Will was already there, standing outside on the porch, arms crossed, wearing a warm jacket. He waved as I pulled up. "You made it," he said, a grin spreading across his face. "I thought you might have chickened out." "Not a chance," I said, hopping out of the car. "I needed this." We exchanged a quick hug, and I started unloading my gear. It wasn't long before we were inside, cracking open beers and catching up on the years we hadn't spent together. Will's family had built the cabin decades ago, and it had been passed down through generations. I could tell it held a lot of memories for him. As the sun began to set, the sky turned an incredible shade of orange, casting long shadows over the land. The air was crisp, cold even, but it felt refreshing. After dinner, we went outside and lit a small fire in the pit in front of the cabin. The crackling of the flames was the only sound around us. It felt good to be that far from everything. It wasn't long before the conversation turned to the past. Will told stories about his childhood, hunting trips with his dad, and the strange things they'd encountered in the woods. I wasn't one to believe in much, but his stories were enough to make me pause. He talked about hearing strange noises at night, something walking outside the cabin when there was no one there. He even mentioned something about a skinwalker, though I didn't take him seriously. "Man, you're just being dramatic," I said, chuckling. "There's no such thing as skinwalkers." Will gave me a sly grin. "Maybe, or maybe not." I laughed it off, but deep down I wasn't so sure. The woods were different here, the air thicker, the silence louder. But I didn't want to let on that I was feeling a little uneasy. Will seemed to notice, though. "Don't worry, nothing's going to happen. We're far enough out here where nothing's going to bother us," he assured me. We spent the rest of the night around the fire, chatting and drinking. The stars above us were like nothing I'd ever seen. So clear, so close, that it almost felt like you could reach out and touch them. Eventually, we decided to call it a night and headed inside. The cabin was warm, with a small wood stove keeping the chill at bay. Will and I each grabbed a couch to crash on. I lay there in the quiet, staring at the ceiling, trying to fall asleep. But something wasn't right. Felt like the air in the cabin had changed. It was as if something was watching us, something waiting. I tried to ignore it, but the thought kept gnawing at me. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. At some point, I must have drifted off to sleep, though I can't say when. The next thing I knew, I was awake to a strange noise outside. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was something deliberate, like footsteps, slow and heavy, crunching over the leaves and twigs. I lay still, holding my breath. My heart was beating in my chest. I didn't want to wake Will, but I couldn't just ignore it either. The noise stopped for a moment, and I thought maybe I was just imagining things. But then I heard it again, closer this time. Footsteps, moving around the cabin, as though someone or something was circling it. I couldn't take it anymore. I quietly got up and grabbed my rifle from the corner of the room. Will stirred on the couch but didn't wake. I moved toward the door, holding my breath. I cracked the door open, just enough to peek outside. The moon was high, casting everything in a silvery light. The woods around the cabin were dark, but there was something out there, a shape moving slowly between the trees. It wasn't human, at least not in the way I understood it. Its movements were too fluid, too unnatural. I stood frozen, watching. Stopped for a moment, and I thought maybe it saw me. My heart pounded in my chest. But then, just like that, it moved again, vanishing into the shadows of the forest. I closed the door as quietly as I could, my hands shaking. I leaned against the wall, trying to steady myself. What the hell had I just seen? My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. I couldn't go back to sleep after that. I sat on the couch, rifle across my lap, waiting. The night dragged on. The silence outside was suffocating, the occasional rustle of leaves the only sound breaking it. By dawn, I was exhausted. The footsteps never returned, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching. When Will finally woke up, I told him what I'd heard, but he just shrugged it off. "You probably heard an animal, maybe a deer or something," he said, not looking up from his coffee. But I knew it wasn't a deer. It wasn't anything I had ever heard before. The next few days passed uneventfully, though I couldn't shake the unease I felt every time I stepped outside the cabin. The woods were thick with trees, and the further we went, the more oppressive it seemed. The air felt heavier, the shadows darker. Will insisted that I was just spooked by the isolation, but I knew better. Then, on the third night, it happened again. We were sitting by the fire when I heard it, the sound of footsteps, this time much closer than before. I stood up, rifle in hand, my heart thumping wildly in my chest. Will noticed immediately. "Dude, what's wrong?" I motioned toward the edge of the trees. There, just out of the firelight, something was moving again. I couldn't make out its shape, but I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on me. "Stay inside," I told Will, my voice low, "Don't come out." I stepped into the darkness, trying to keep my composure. The noise continued, growing louder as I moved further into the woods. I couldn't tell if it was an animal or something else, but it felt wrong. The air was thick, the trees closing in around me. I had a feeling that whatever it was waiting for me to get closer. I heard a low growl in the distance. It wasn't like any animal I knew. This sound wasn't from the forest. It was something primal, something human-like. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was then that I saw it, the creature. It wasn't like any animal I had ever seen. Its eyes gleamed in the moonlight, red and wild. Its face was twisted, but it wasn't quite human, not entirely. There was a deep, primal terror in its gaze. I raised my rifle, but it didn't move. It just stood there watching, and then, in an instant, it was gone. Not running, not fleeing. It just disappeared into the trees. I didn't hesitate. I turned and sprinted back toward the cabin, heart racing. Will was waiting by the door, looking out into the night. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice low and shaky. "I don't know," I said, my voice hoarse, "but we're not alone out here." I didn't sleep that night. Neither did Will. The next morning, we packed up everything as quickly as we could. We didn't speak much, but we both knew that whatever it was we had encountered, it wasn't something we could explain away. As we drove away from the cabin, the woods behind us seemed to swallow it whole, disappearing into the distance. I don't know what it was, but I do know one thing. I'll never return to that cabin. There are things in those woods, things that shouldn't be there, and I don't want to find out what they are. It was a cold, dreary evening when I arrived at the small cabin in the middle of nowhere. The kind of cabin you only find if you really try, tucked away deep in the woods of the United Kingdom. My cousin, Rachel, had invited me out for the weekend to get away from the hustle and bustle of city life. She'd found the place through a friend who owned it, and we were both eager to have some quiet time away from work and distractions. The weather was relentless, a steady drizzle falling from the overcast sky. The rain pounded against the roof as I made my way up the narrow path leading to the cabin. It wasn't much, just a simple two-story structure with wooden walls, a stone fireplace, and a small kitchen, but it was perfect for what we needed: peace and isolation. I wasn't exactly thrilled about the weather. I had hoped for at least a glimpse of sunshine, but no such luck. Still, Rachel was excited, and that was enough to put my mind at ease. I couldn't deny the appeal of escaping to the countryside for a few days. After unloading my bags from the car, I entered the cabin and was greeted by the warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth. Rachel was already there, her smile wide as she welcomed me in. She had been there for a couple of hours already, settling in and getting the place ready for our stay. "Glad you made it. I was starting to think you weren't going to show up," she joked, handing me a mug of hot tea. I took it gratefully and settled into the couch by the fire. The scent of wood smoke filled the air, blending with the earthy smell of wet pine that seeped in through the cracks of the cabin. It felt cozy, peaceful, but the isolation of the cabin made me uneasy in a way I couldn't explain. We spent the first few hours chatting, catching up on life and laughing over silly stories. But as night fell and the rain showed no sign of stopping, the atmosphere changed. It became heavier, thicker, as if the woods outside had swallowed the world whole. The cabin, which had felt like a sanctuary before, now felt like a cage. Around 8 o'clock, we decided to go outside for a walk. Rachel insisted that we take a stroll to the small clearing near the cabin. I hesitated but eventually agreed. The rain had lightened to a fine mist, and the cool air was refreshing after the warmth of the fire. We bundled up in our coats and headed out, our footsteps muffled by the soft, wet ground. The cabin's lights faded behind us as we moved deeper into the woods, the trees towering over us like silent sentinels. The dense canopy above blocked out much of what little light the overcast sky provided, making it feel darker than it should have been for that time of evening. As we walked further, the sound of the rain falling on the leaves above us grew louder, and my thoughts began to wander. The woods were so silent, so still. Every now and then, a twig snapped in the distance, but the noise was so faint, I wondered if it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Rachel, blissfully unaware of my unease, continued talking about her plans for the next few days. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was the kind of feeling you get when you know you're being watched but can't figure out why. It wasn't anything tangible, just a creeping sense that the woods around us were hiding something. We reached the clearing, a small patch of grass surrounded by dense trees. The mist had thickened, wrapping around the trunks like a ghostly shroud. I took a deep breath, hoping the fresh air would calm my nerves. But just as I was about to turn back, something caught my eye. A figure standing motionless in the distance, just beyond the tree line. I froze. My heart skipped a beat as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure was tall, maybe 6 feet or more, dressed in dark, ragged clothes that blended into the shadows. It was standing perfectly still, as if it had been waiting for us. I blinked, thinking it might have been a trick of the light or a figment of my imagination. But when I looked again, the figure was still there, unmoving, its presence unmistakable. "Rachel," I whispered, my voice barely audible. She didn't hear me at first, still talking animatedly about something. But when I grabbed her arm, she turned to face me. "What is it?" she asked, looking around as if expecting to find some danger in the woods. "Do you see that?" I pointed toward the figure. Rachel squinted into the darkness but shook her head. "See what?" I turned back to where the figure had been, but now it was gone. The space was empty, the trees standing silently in the mist. I felt my pulse quicken. "There was someone there," I said, the words coming out shakier than I intended. Rachel raised an eyebrow. "You're scaring yourself, that's all. There's no one out here." But I knew what I had seen. I couldn't explain it, but I had felt it. Something was off. The woods felt wrong. We started heading back to the cabin, but as we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure reappear, but it never did. Still, the unsettling sense of being watched lingered, like eyes from the shadows. When we reached the cabin, I locked the door behind us without a second thought. The warmth of the fire was a relief, but the unease wouldn't leave me. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the trees, wouldn't let go. Rachel noticed my change in mood and asked if I was all right, but I just nodded and said I was tired. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the steady patter of rain against the cabin windows. Later that night, when Rachel had gone to bed, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bed, staring up at the ceiling, the soft creaking of the cabin around me making the unease in my chest grow. The wind had picked up, and I could hear branches scraping against the windows, adding to the eerie atmosphere. I finally decided to get up and make myself a cup of tea, hoping it would help me relax. As I walked through the dark cabin, I felt a sudden chill run down my spine. I wasn't sure if it was the cold or just my nerves, but something didn't feel right. I reached the kitchen, and as I stood there waiting for the kettle to boil, I thought I heard something. A faint rustling sound, coming from somewhere in the cabin. At first, I dismissed it as the house settling, but then it came again, closer this time. It was almost like someone was moving around inside the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned off the kettle and grabbed the closest thing I could find for protection: a large kitchen knife. I didn't know if I was overreacting, but the hair on the back of my neck was standing up, and my instincts told me something was wrong. I slowly made my way down the hall, trying to be as quiet as possible. The sound of footsteps was faint but unmistakable. It was coming from upstairs, where Rachel's room was. I crept up the stairs, holding my breath. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it someone from the woods? A burglar? A prank? But nothing seemed to make sense. I reached the top of the stairs and froze. The door to Rachel's room was slightly ajar, the faint glow of moonlight spilling into the hallway. But as I stood there, listening, the footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking as I entered the room. My eyes immediately scanned the room. Rachel was still asleep, curled up under the blankets. But the window was wide open, the curtains billowing in the wind. I felt a surge of panic. Someone had been inside, I was sure of it. But there was no sign of anyone. The only clue was the window. I closed it quickly and locked it, then stood there, heart racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who had been in the cabin? Why had they left without a trace? I stayed up for the rest of the night, watching over Rachel and the cabin, my mind racing with thoughts of the figure in the woods and the strange events that followed. I couldn't explain it, but deep down, I knew we weren't alone. The next morning, everything seemed normal. The sun had finally broken through the clouds, and the cabin felt like a completely different place. But as we packed our bags and prepared to leave, I noticed something on the ground just outside the cabin. It was a single muddy boot print leading off into the woods. I didn't say anything to Rachel, but I knew then that we weren't alone in those woods. Whoever or whatever had been watching us was still out there, and I wasn't sure if we would ever truly be safe. We left that day, driving away from the cabin with the uneasy feeling still hanging over me. The woods, the figure, the footsteps inside the cabin. All of it remained with me, a lingering reminder that sometimes the most frightening things are the ones we can't explain.